In fact, synthetic happiness has almost always been understood as something that we have to put some effort toward achieving. But, and this is an important thing to point out, synthetic happiness also requires that certain situational or environmental conditions be met. A good example of this is some of the work by Gillian Mandich, or I should say Dr. Gillian Mandich, who's done some interesting work on the conditions for creating happiness within our mind and in our overall state of being. And she's been involved in a number of different studies, but one of the ones that I found particularly interesting is one in which they explored different types of music and other aspects of environmental settings. So you bring subjects to the laboratory, play them different types of music. There are, in fact, certain aspects of music that can create different states of mind: sadness, happiness, anticipation. In fact, there are certain patterns of music that can reliably induce anticipation of the fear and anxiety-based type. So for instance, think the movie Jaws. If you recall, for those of you that have seen Jaws, there's this ongoing theme music anytime the shark might be present in the water or in a given scene, that essentially goes dun-dun. Now, for the musicians out there, this has basis in things like tritones and things that are understood from the mathematics and the musical side, and from the neuroscience side are known to create a neural state of anticipation. Yeah, a neural state of anticipation, and not necessarily a positive one. And indeed, there are other patterns of music that involve uptones. Think some of the music that's typically been used in cartoons of various sorts. There's a long history of this. Indeed, there's a whole literature of psychological and now even a smaller but still interesting literature on the neuroscience of how certain patterns of music can induce a state of joy and joyful anticipation in particular. A lot of those patterns of music are incorporated into so-called happy cartoons and Disney movies and things of that sort. In any case, Dr. Mandich and others have explored how music in particular, but other features of the environment, can or cannot induce states of happiness. And the basic takeaway from those studies is that while having a certain environmental sound, musical tone, or visual feature to a given space, a room, is necessary for a state of happiness, it is not alone sufficient. What is required is that individuals not only be placed into an environment that contains music or visual items, or a combination of music and visual items that can induce states of joy or happiness or positive anticipation, but that they also are given some sort of instruction or instruction manual as to how to synthesize happiness inside of that environment. This is important because what this says is that our ability to create states of happiness is dependent on our environment, but also requires effort from us. That also makes sense as to why when we are under conditions of deprivation, so it could be social deprivation or financial deprivation, or even for people that are very sensitive to weather, there are a certain number of individuals, about 30% of people who report feeling very, very low under conditions where the sky is overcast, especially if it's been overcast for a number of days, the so-called seasonal affective depression. Those individuals, by the way, can often receive tremendous benefits in terms of elevating their mood if they make an effort to get sunlight, and if they can't get sunlight, artificial light of the sort that we talked about earlier. But in any case, there are a number of people that are profoundly negatively influenced by the lack of positive visual and auditory cues in their environment. But for most people, we are in what I would call a dynamic relationship with our environment. Our environment has an effect on our mood, but the research indicates that we also need to make some sort of effort toward being happy. Now, effort toward being happy is a very vague term, so let's better define what that is. In the case of Dr. Mandich's work, this took the form of doing so-called happiness inventories, right? That can be focusing on things that one is grateful for, things that they particularly enjoy. This is somewhat of a gratitude type practice, but includes some other features as well that are more focused on the things that bring you meaning and actually engaging in the things that bring you meaning. So if you're trying to think about how to improve your levels of happiness, what this research essentially says is that you would be smart to try and adjust your home environment, adjust your work environment so that it is cheerful to you. Maybe that means a plant. For me, in my laboratory, one of the things that was really critical that I had as a postdoc and in my own laboratory when I first started my lab was I love aquaria. So I had multiple fish tanks. In fact, people in my laboratory were always rolling their eyes. Why do we have to have all these fish tanks with all these? I like freshwater tanks, not saltwater tanks, for reasons that aren't interesting for this discussion. But freshwater tanks with discus fish, for instance, to me are just beautiful. They make me happy. I just enjoy them. Music is a complicated thing in laboratories because it's a shared space, so headphones are the general requirement. But having either silence, if you love silence, and I happen to like working in silence or listening to certain forms of music. I do also use the 40 hertz binaural beats, or I particularly like listening to Glenn Gould while I work, or listening to whale song, believe it or not, while I work, because it doesn't have any structure that I can follow. I don't speak whale, and so I can't follow, but it sort of fills the space in a way that I find pleasant. And I've put substantial amounts of effort into making my laboratory spaces and my office spaces, my workspaces, nice places to be. Now, I had no knowledge of this work from Dr. Mandich and others at the time when I did that, but what I found was that over the years, I was challenged in maintaining a kind of elevated mood while working in a laboratory, not because I didn't thoroughly enjoy the work. I love doing experiments with my hands, and I loved being in lab, but at least the labs that I was in as a graduate student and postdoc, there were no windows, so I wasn't getting adequate sunshine. The windows that we didn't have didn't open, so I wasn't getting a lot of fresh air, and so on and so forth. So I've personally found it very valuable to create an environment, both at work and at home, that I find aesthetically pleasant, at least in some way or another. And I realize people have varying levels of control over their aesthetic environment. Certainly the auditory environment can be controlled nowadays through the use of headphones, if you're allowed to use those. So for instance, using music or using background sound that you find very pleasant, combined with a concerted effort on your part to create states of happiness by hopefully doing work that's meaningful to you, or at least is leading to meaningful outcomes. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But these happiness inventories also turn out to be interesting and important sources of creating so-called synthetic happiness. And we will also talk about other ways that one can create elevated levels of synthetic happiness. And I realize the word synthetic probably draws up connotations of false happiness or contrived happiness. I wish instead of calling it synthetic happiness, they had called it self-created or self-directed happiness or something of that sort, because then it wouldn't sound as false, because it's simply not false. It leads to the same, as far as we know, identical neurochemical and psychological states of happiness as natural happiness, and might even be more persistent than natural happiness. It certainly is more under our control. But the key point is that environment and self-directed work at being happy are both important, and they interact with one another. So if you're somebody who has a hard time synthesizing happiness through any of the methods that we talk about today, don't consider yourself deficient. It could very well be that the environment that you're in, social environment or physical environment or auditory environment, is simply not conducive to synthesizing happiness. And